Hello friends, we have a big week this week. Module 4 is a big chunk of your final project. So we're going to go through it step by step just to make sure that everything that you can possibly think of around this is going to be in shape when you turn it in. Okay, so let's take a look as we begin. So you've already chosen your topic and your two creative works in the Module 2 project proposal. Now, your Module 3 assignment was about learning about perspectives and biases. That was a self-reflective exercise. And what we're going to do to start this module's assignment is to think about that from another person's perspective. So you'll remember in the last video, I talked about thinking about what perspectives are. Remember, it comes from people's experience and it comes from what factors have played into how they view a topic, which of course can lead to biases and assumptions. So I want to take you through an example. So this is a famous painting of the American Revolution by Emanuel Leutzer. Okay, so it's a passionate painting about George Washington crossing the Delaware, which was of course a major moment in the Revolutionary War. So this is about the topic of being an American and patriotism and what that means here in the United States. So obviously there's a few things that are going to play into this perspective. For one thing, Leutzer was not from the 1700s when this event occurred. He actually painted this in 1851, which means he was not alive when this particular event happened. Now that's an important factor in how he perceived this event. He didn't perceive it in real time. He perceived it after the event. So he is seeing it through the lens of other people, right? And one of the ways that we can actually know that is because this particular ship is not actually capable of carrying this many men. It would have tipped over into the sea. So clearly this is not somebody who knew what was actually happening in the Revolutionary War. Now, because he's distanced from the war as well, he makes the decision about who he wishes to see in the painting. Now, you'll notice as we look at these faces that they are all one color. But in fact, in the Revolutionary War, you had people from all nations, including Native Americans, including people from Europe, including people who were from African nations who had been brought over as slaves and who had since been freed, were fighting for the freedom of the colonies. But yet in this painting from 1851, we see the bias that it was white people alone who were driving that issue. Now, that is an assumption and a bias in this painting that could alter how we see and move forward with how we're going to talk about it. It's not that those biases are necessarily bad. In fact, a number of white people fought and died in the American Revolutionary War. That's not the point. The point is, we're looking for who isn't at the table, right? Because once we know that, we can also uncover perhaps other ideas that are really important. I think the fact that Native Americans were not only soldiers, but scouts and diplomats in the war. Not just fighting on the lines, but actually doing the high-level administrative work seems really important to pay attention to. Okay, so what you're doing here in these first two questions are thinking about the same ideas you were thinking about in Module 3's assignment, but from the artist's perspective for your creative works. So you're going to think about that. What do your artists bring to the table in terms of diverse perspectives? And what are some biases and assumptions that they bring to the table that maybe need to be thought about as you're moving forward? Okay, so that ends our first part of the assignment. Now we're going to move on to part 2, which is about how these creative works build a relationship between how you view yourself and the way society moves and operates and is, right? Okay, so let's think about this first sentence. Describe how the creative works create meaning. That seems a little bit vague, so let me explain to you what that means. When you're looking at a painting, what you're trying to do is figure out how it's portraying the topic that you're talking about. So let's go back to this painting that we were talking about. This is obviously supposed to be a patriotic painting. So it's intended to inspire patriotism. So now what I have to do is connect what's in this creative work with that topic. Okay, so obviously George Washington is one of our big patriotic heroes. And so what they've done in this painting, what Leutzer has done, is taken the two pieces of light and shown it right on his face. Everybody else is in darkness, but he is leading them into the light. Do you see how that creates meaning around the idea of patriotism? We take a hero of ours and we use that figure to move us forward. Okay, so that's one way that it creates meaning. It helps the audience make sense of the topic. When you're doing this particular question, please think about how you can quote or describe your poems, your songs, your films, how you use those specifics to tell us how it helps us understand the topic. And also, help us make sense. How does it make us sense of our society? So obviously in our society, we think of George Washington and his gumption and his steadfastness as some of our real American virtues. We're the ones who should be out doing the hard work, crossing the Delaware, even though it's dangerous, to get our freedom and our ability to be free. Okay, well, this certainly makes that look like that, right? We have a river and it's cold, and this man looks afraid, and yet we have this steadfast leader. So that's some of the ways that you making meaning around the idea of your topic. What are the elements of your creative works that help us understand more deeply how important your topic is to society? Okay. Then we're going to talk about how creative works have impacted society's perception of the topic. Now, this might not be just your singular creative work. It might be a collection of creative works. And you can talk about your creative work kind of in that larger idea. So in this particular case, for example, with this painting, this is one of many, many paintings made of the American Revolutionary War. And the whole idea was to inspire this idea and this myth of America as this go-get-em, free group of people who genuinely want to have the freedom of expression and freedom of the American dream, as it will. And it created a mythos around, by that, the myth and the idea, these sort of grand ideas that, created figures like George Washington. Let's not forget, George Washington had wooden teeth, so it's not like he was a superhero. He was very human. Okay, so our society's perception of the topic, if I was doing patriotism, is really heavily influenced by works like these, because it helps us think about that myth of American heroes and what that looks like. Your creative works are going to talk about diversity and activism and mental health. So maybe your creative work with mental health is helping us to understand mental health as a healthcare issue. Maybe your work on activism is showing how we all need to be working towards a better society. Okay, when we're talking about how creative works might be perceived by different groups of people, what you're thinking about is dichotomies. So things like rich versus poor, old versus young, maybe north versus south, or California versus New York. Think about people who are different than yourself. You understand how you perceive the creative work because we've worked on that up here in the Module 2 proposal. We already know that, how you perceive it. Now I want you to think of people who are opposite from you. So if you're young, if you're in your 20s, think about how someone who's much older might perceive that topic. Think about how people who are not even from the United States might view that topic. So, like if we, for example, showed this to somebody who lived in Tanzania, for example, what might they perceive as these kinds of figures. First of all, Tanzania, some areas, especially in the mountains, get a little bit colder, but really there's a lot of winter wear for what is generally a tropic climate. So they might see this and think of it. They might even think of it as European. They might not think of it as American at first, especially if they don't know that that's George Washington. And that's interesting because if they think of this as European, that's something intriguing, because don't forget, we as Americans, especially white Americans, came from Europe. And so our European roots often have a lot of effect on how we view patriotism. So when you're thinking about different groups of people, in your three topics, it might have a lot to do with some underlying assumptions. Older people might not view mental health as something that we're supposed to talk about. But you can also talk about how those groups struggle with mental health issues in different ways. Rich people may not perceive mental health as something that's, of course we all are in therapy, we can all afford it, right? So that's kind of it. These are some interesting dichotomies, because different people on those different ends of the spectrums will guide you to different ideas about that. How does your creative work influence the development of empathy? So think about that. How does it help people who have maybe one of these different ideas, some of these different groups of people? How do they develop empathy by seeing your creative works? So, for example, if somebody said, well, I don't understand why freedom is so important, if they see this painting, perhaps they would understand that these men, these young men, and well, some of them weren't so young, were really giving up their lives in dangerous situations for an idea. Maybe that would help them develop empathy for the United States and what we went through in our revolution. When you're thinking about development of empathy, it may be something like activism. Maybe people think, well, I don't know why they need to be going out and protesting, but maybe they see a piece of a painting that shows people who are really suffering, and they go, well, maybe those protests are really in favor of something that I also support. And it helps me to empathize with what they are actually trying to do. So notice that this different groups first get you started thinking about different ways that people approach the topic, and then we think about how they can develop empathy from that. Okay, so explain how the creative works encourage critical thinking regarding the topic. Now this is kind of a culmination of all of these questions put together. So really what we're trying to get you to do is think about how society views that topic and then changes because of the painting. So let's go back to this one and think about where we started. So we know that this is a painting of the American Revolution. We know different groups may not necessarily be Americans, may not understand a lot of the things that we're talking about. And those European roots come out in that. Interestingly enough, that can help us understand the American Revolution even better. Why did they break off from Europe? What needed to be different in the United States than those European nations that they left? And that leads us to an even deeper understanding about the meaning of patriotism than we have if we just look at this and go, oh, well, that's a cute picture of George Washington. So in your works, think about how your topic has taken you from just a superficial understanding of your topic that you talked about in Module 2, and how society's perception, different groups of people, development of empathy, and those really specific ideas from the painting have led us to a different understanding about the topic. This is a big assignment, so make sure that you're leaving enough time. There needs to be some thinking time in here as well. As always, if you have any questions, I am really happy to help. Have a great week.